what is your vision of free banking?
You may remember the aphorism of Willie Sutton, the bank robber, who was asked, "Why do you rob banks?"
That's
Said,
where the
"That's
money
where
is."
the money is." Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, why do governments regulate banks? That's where the money is. I mean, a lot of bank regulations in many countries came out of the fiscal needs of the central government. So the banks were required to buy the government's debt. In the U.S., that was part of the National Banking Acts passed during the Civil War. In other cases, the central bank was created in order to lend to the government. Napoleon created the Bank of France, and he instructed them that they should paint on the wall of the bank over the doorway so they saw it every day. It is the duty of the Bank of France to lend to the government at 2%. In other cases, it was more roundabout. The Bank of England was created in order to lend the government debt. It wasn't thought of as a central bank, but given its special relationship with the government and its guarantee that it would not fail, it became a central bank over the years. And so those kinds of events have led to the regulation of banks in ways that make them unfree. In particular, central banks have monopolized the issue of currency, paper money, hand-to-hand currency. And they've imposed portfolio restrictions on banks, reserve requirements where the bank is required to hold the liability, any commercial bank is required to hold the liabilities of the central bank. That helps generate some profit for the central bank. Now, there have been some important exceptions historically, systems that got pretty far along while they were still free, before governments clamped down on them. The one I've studied the most closely is the Scottish free banking system, which lasted until 1844, at which point Scotland had its own banking system, although it was then ruled by the Crown and the Parliament of Great Britain. It had grown up with its own legal system, and that was still respected. But they decided to impose new rules on the Bank of England, and kind of as an afterthought, they decided to impose the same rules on Scotland. And I've looked in the legislative record, and there's never any clear explanation of why they're doing it, since there's no problem in Scotland to be solved. The banking system was just fine. But they seem to have been worried that it was an embarrassment for their theory that we need to have a central bank, that there was this example of a system without a central bank that was functioning just fine. The Scottish banks didn't protest very loudly against the imposition of regulations because they were very cleverly crafted to privilege the existing banks. So Sir Robert Peel, in Peel's Bank Charter Act of 1844, provided that the existing Scottish, and there was a further act in 1845, but they provided that the existing Scottish banks were recognized and their right to issue notes was recognized, but no new banks of issue were going to be allowed. And so the existing banks said, well, in theory we're in favor of competition, but we can live with this. No new competitors for us, that's great, we can continue issuing notes. So bank regulations of those sorts were conceived in ways that were in the interest of incumbent banks by restricting competition from new banks. And restriction on entry into banking has long been something that's in the interest of incumbent banks. In the United States, we had separate banking regulation state by state, and in many states, to get a bank charter meant to get a little monopoly. Banks were restricted in their branching, so if you got a charter for this county, you were the only bank in that county. In some states, it was each bank only had one office. They weren't even allowed to branch within a city or a county. So creating little monopoly privileges led to those kind of branching geographic restrictions on banks. And when banks, under those kinds of restrictions, proved unstable, that becomes the pretext for further regulations. So in the United States, the system created under the Civil War still didn't allow banks to branch out, required them to hold federal debt, didn't allow them to respond to seasonal variations in the demand for currency because they could only issue as much currency as they had federal debt. So that was very inelastic was the word they used at a time, very rigid system. Meanwhile, in Canada had a fairly free banking system. There are some minor regulations on it. but the banks were free to vary their note circulation seasonally, and they were free to branch across the entire country. The banks were very stable, low failure rate. There were two ways the U.S. could have gone. It could have adopted the Canadian model, and there were people at the time who advocated that. But it being the progressive era, instead we got the Federal Reserve Act, where the federal government said we were going to add another layer of regulation to fix the problems created by the previous layer of regulation.